Good afternoon and welcome everyone to our Markets 101 webinar co-hosted by Renewable Northwest and Northwest Energy Coalition. My name is Lauren McCloy. I'm the Policy Director for the Northwest Energy Coalition. I'll be moderating our panel today. As a reminder, today's webinar is intended as an introductory resource for stakeholders who have some background in energy issues generally, but are new to energy market issues. And we'll have a mixture of coalition members and non-members on this webinar today. We'll be talking about why markets are important for meeting clean energy goals, ensuring energy system reliability, creating new career opportunities, and keeping electricity rates affordable. We have a lot of content to cover, and we hope that these presentations can serve as a resource for you, as well as other partners and allies who are interested in getting engaged in these issues going forward. This webinar is being recorded, and the slides and recording will be posted on our website. As you'll see, there's a wealth of additional information available in the slides. And I want to start by just saying if there are members of the press who wish to use this content, please reach out to Chris Connolly at chris@nwenergy.org. We have an exciting expert panel lined up for you this afternoon. Now I'll go to the next slide. First, a quick introduction about us. The Northwest Energy Coalition advances clean, equitable, and affordable energy policies by leveraging our analytic expertise and convening a broad alliance of people and organizations. And Renewable Northwest's mission is to decarbonize the region by accelerating the transition to renewable electricity. We have been partnering, our two organizations have been partnering on working on broader market issues in the Northwest and the West broadly, and we're very happy to bring you this Markets 101 content today. We have an exciting expert panel lined up this afternoon. First, we have Robin Arnold, Markets and Transmission Director at Renewable Northwest, a renewable energy advocacy organization focused on the 4 Northwest states. Robin is based in Helena, Montana. We also have Kathleen Stacks, Executive Director of Western Freedom, a coalition of large commercial and industrial customers working with economic development organizations, environmental advocates, local and state governments, labor groups, and more to support an efficient and integrated Western grid. Kathleen is based in Denver, Colorado, and is joining us today from San Diego. We also have Caitlin Leotiris, Principal at Energy Strategies, a consulting firm specializing in technical analysis and energy system modeling, with clients including utilities, developers, government agencies, large energy users, and nonprofit organizations, including NWEC. Caitlin is joining us from Salt Lake City, Utah. And finally, we have Mike Milligan, independent power system consultant with more than 34 years of experience and expertise in bulk system reliability and resource adequacy operations, economics, and resource planning. Mike is also based outside of Denver, Colorado. We'll start with an introductory presentation from Robin and then transition through our panelist presentations. We have reserved time after each panel to answer any questions, so feel free to put your questions in the chat. And after the presentations, please stick around for our moderated Q&A, where we'll also provide another opportunity for questions and discussion. And with that, I am happy to hand it over to Robin Arnold to provide an overview of existing markets in the region and state, regional, and federal activities.
Hello, I'll start by giving an overview of what is happening in Western markets, what a regional transmission organization is, and what we currently have in the West. Next slide, please. So regional transmission organizations are nonprofit, independently operated bulk electric power systems. They were developed in the 1990s as a result of federal policy to encourage competitive generation through open access to transmission. Many RTOs initially began as power pools between 1 or 2 utilities that eventually evolved as more utilities joined to become independent system operators. And then they were transitioned to regional transmission organizations with the encouragement from the federal policy and when these transmission power pools pooled all of their operations and consolidated into having one operator for each regional transmission organization. RTOs include markets that allow buyers and sellers to bid for or offer generation, which leads to economic dispatch of resources. Currently, as you can see from this map, 2/3 of electricity load within the United States is served in an RTO. As you can also see from this map, the West and the Southeast are the only two regions that still operate in what's considered a traditional wholesale electricity market. Utilities in these regions are responsible for system operations and management, including providing power to retail customers. Most utilities in these regions own their own generation, transmission, and distribution systems used to serve their customers. Transactions occur on a bilateral basis between two parties rather than through economic dispatch across the entire footprint, as happens within regional transmission organizations. Next slide, please. Currently, there are 38 separate balancing authorities in the West. You may be asking yourself right now, what is a balancing authority? Within balancing authorities, supply of electricity, which is the load, must match demand or the end-use consumption for the transmission system to remain reliable. Imbalances can lead to blackouts. Each balancing authority is responsible for maintaining equilibrium on its own system within their region, as well as coordinating with neighboring regions. Balancing is achieved through turning generators on or off, importing or exporting electricity to neighboring regions, or by reducing consumption. BAs are responsible for determining how much capacity can be sold on their transmission systems. For generating resources that need to cross multiple BAs to serve their customers, multiple transmission rights must be secured. I'll explain how this impacts rates a little more in a few slides. Next slide, please. So what is problematic with having 38 different BAs in the West? As you can see from this map shows different resource potential in the region. You can see the blue indicates lots of wind-rich resources onshore in states like Montana and Wyoming, as well as offshore along the California, Oregon, and Washington coast. The yellow and orange colors show solar potential in California and the Southwest, and the purple shows geothermal potential. In order to economically access all of these resources in the region, we need transmission to connect the regions to each other so that the resources can be economically dispatched and exported to regions in need of the resources. For example, if California has no connectivity to the rest of the region, when it has a surplus of solar in the middle of the day, it would need to curtail that solar if it did not have enough load to use it. If it were connected to the rest of the region, however, it could export that solar that would otherwise be curtailed. BAs control transmission at the local level. There are 3 regional entities that engage in transmission planning. However, these entities only study reliability over a 10-year planning horizon. New lines can take over 15 years to build, which makes a 10-year planning horizon problematic. Also, these entities solely focus on reliability. They are not looking at resource least cost planning, which is done separately by utilities on an individual basis in the West. There's no coordinated planning that occurs between these planning regions, which makes it difficult to study larger, more efficient lines that may cross multiple jurisdictions. There's also a lack of coordinated cost allocation to determine who benefits and pays for any larger new transmission line that would cross multiple jurisdictions. Next slide, please. In an RTO, resources only pay one tariff rate for transmission. In the West, however, resources must pay the transmission tariff rate for each BA that it crosses, as it must pay for the ancillary balancing services within each BA. These rates layer on top of each other, resulting in what is frequently referred to as pancaked rates, as the stack of rates resembles a stack of pancakes. In this example, we're looking at the cost of transmission for a resource located in Montana that wants to serve load in Washington state. On this slide, you can see each of the BA's transmission rates. plus the Montana intertie rate, which is a segmented rate that BPA charges for access to the portion of the coal strip line that transitions from Northwestern Energy's BA to BPA's BA. Next slide, please. This slide shows the cost of transmission service with the added cost of line losses. As electricity crosses the transmission system, a small portion of electricity is lost, which is then factored into rates that the transmission customer pays. In this scenario, we estimate that the resource costs $30 a megawatt hour for its electricity. The transmission rate varies depending on what BAs it needs to cross. If the resource is serving customers solely within BPA's network, the transmission cost is $5.96 per megawatt hour. If, however, it is located in Montana and serving Avista's load, it is likely to cross Northwestern Energy, BPA, and Avista's BAs, which will result in an end cost of $26.58 per megawatt hour. This can make a lot of projects uncompetitive when you're adding that $26.58 onto the $30 per megawatt hour that the electricity costs. Next slide, please. So on this slide, it shows what rates are like in an RTO, which is PJM. PJM initially stood for Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland. It's an RTO that now covers a larger region in the East. Versus what transmission costs in the Pacific Northwest for a new wind resource. In this scenario, the levelized cost of energy is $40 per megawatt hour, which is levelized over 15 years. You can see in PJM, there's a capacity revenue. Within several RTOs, such as PJM, there's a capacity market. So resources receive value for the capacity they contribute to the system for resource adequacy. That does not exist in the Northwest. And you can see transmission, there's a large differentiation there. It's only $1 in PJM versus $12 for BPA transmission and integration charges. BPA charges variable resources such as wind to flatten the shape of their load so that it's a flat shape throughout the entire year. Within an RTO, however, they transact on day ahead and real time, so they do not need to flatten loads the same way that Bonneville Power does. This ends up resulting in $15.71 more for resources located in the Northwest, rather than what that same resource would cost if it were located within an RTO. Next slide, please. And next slide. These maps show the existing energy imbalance markets that are in the West currently. An energy imbalance market balances demand every 15 minutes and dispatches generation resources every 5 minutes within the least cost energy available. Benefits include reduced costs through lower reserves needed by utilities, more efficient use of transmission, reduced carbon emissions, and lower cost integration of renewable energy, as well as enhanced reliability through improved management of transmission line congestion. California's energy imbalance market, which is the map on the left, has saved participants more than $2 billion compared to what they otherwise would have spent since it first launched in 2014. Markets Plus on the right is much more recent. It launched in February of 2021. I have not seen total benefits yet. However, participants are continuing to join, with Black Hills Power, Platte River Authority, and Xcel Energy planning to join in April of this year. These two footprints are also competing with each other to develop an extended day ahead market. Extended day ahead markets are based on forecasted load for the next day. Scheduling occurs the morning prior to the day ahead market run. In energy imbalance markets, which we currently have, account for about 5% of energy transactions within their footprints, whereas the extended day ahead market would account for 80 to 90% of what would happen within its footprint. This makes transmission much more complicated, as transmission owners are unwilling to voluntarily donate transmission for day ahead markets the same way they are in the imbalance market, simply because pretty much all energy transactions would be happening on the day ahead market. Next slide, please. Oh, one thing I didn't mention on the last slide, but worth mentioning, the Western Power Pool is developing a Western Resource Adequacy program in the West. Its footprint is similar to the CAISO EIM footprint without the California entities, as California already has its own resource adequacy program. It is not a market, however, it's a voluntary program to share capacity resources in the region, which is intended to aid participating members in meeting customers' electricity demand during extreme events. And it is operated by the Southwest Power Pool. It recently received FERC approval on February 10th of 2023 and is currently in a non-binding forward showing phase with 20 participants in 9 Western states and Canada. The binding phase is expected to begin next year in 2024. However, participants can delay joining that phase until 2028. In that phase, there will be penalties for utilities that do not comply with the requirements of the program. And this slide just reviews the differences between an energy imbalance market and a full RTO. The main difference that you should take away from this is that the RTO has functional control of the transmission system and engages in coordinated regional planning within the entire footprint, which does not happen in an imbalance market, a day-ahead market, or a resource adequacy program. Next slide, please. And next slide. Several states have initiated varying dockets or passed legislation to look into regional markets in the West. In Arizona, the Arizona Corporation Commission opened a docket in 2021 to investigate regional planning. No schedule has been set yet for this docket. I believe they've gone through several information gathering phases, but they have not done anything formal with this docket yet. In New Mexico in 2020, in Colorado in 2021 and Nevada in 2021, both states passed legislation that requires their regulated utilities to join an organized wholesale market by January 1st of 2030, absent a waiver from their respective public utility commissions. In Colorado, they also created an electric transmission authority and created new rules for their public utility commission to certify new transmission lines. Nevada created a task force to explore regional markets in the West. And then they also require their regulated utility to file a transmission infrastructure plan with their public utility commission. In Oregon in 2021, they passed a study bill to look at RTOs. The final study was released in December of 2021. They also passed House Bill 2021, which requires retail electricity providers to reduce electricity greenhouse gas emissions to 80% below baseline emission levels by 2030 and 100% by 2040. Within the bill, it acknowledges that regional markets play a critical role in achieving the 100% zero carbon emissions in an affordable manner. Washington in 2019 through 2020 passed their Clean Energy Transformation Act, which requires utilities to be 100% greenhouse neutral by 2030, allowing for natural gas offsets, and 100% renewable or non-emitting by 2045. The Washington Utility Commission established a carbon and electricity markets working group to examine CETA's integration with electricity markets outside the state, as well as its compatibility with cap and trade programs such as California that already exist. The rest of my slides simply go through some federal initiatives that have happened. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has opened dockets to explore transmission planning. The Department of Energy funded a state-led study that Caitlin will be discussing in more detail. And Congress passed the Invest in America Act that includes many provisions to provide for transmission siting, increased authority for Bonneville Power Administration, as well as allowing the federal government to be an anchor tenant for new transmission lines to be built. The effects of this bill have not yet come into play. DOE has been launching several initiatives to get this bill up and running, but hopefully it will lead to some new transmission in the region. And then my last slide simply contains many more studies that you can all look into if you have interest in learning more about regional markets.
Great, thank you, Robin. And next we will transition over to Caitlin Leotiris, who is going to talk about the benefits of markets in the West. Hopefully folks can see my screen.
It still looks like it's loading to me. So am I the only one that's seen that, or are you guys seeing the slide?
It looks like it's loading to me as well.
Okay. Well, maybe while we wait for that, and if need be, I can certainly pick up and share my screen. As Lauren mentioned, my name is Caitlin Leotiris. I'm a principal at Energy Strategies. We are a consulting firm in Salt Lake City, and I have spent a lot of time on Western market issues over the last 15 years or so. So I don't date as far back as some of the initial discussions of Western market formation, but have been doing this for quite some time and have seen a lot of back and forth on market development activity in the region. And as we'll talk about a little bit more, Energy Strategies, my firm has done a lot of different studies on the issue, especially over the last couple of years. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that and talking about what the benefits of markets are. I want to spend a little bit of time with all of you just giving some context for what we mean when we say market benefits or savings associated with market formation. I think it's really important to kind of set that context and make sure we're all in alignment and understand kind of what we mean when we say benefits, which we'll talk more about the actual numbers shortly. Let me go to the next slide. I'm kind of talking through what I'm going to talk about. Great. And then I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the different types of energy market benefits. There are a lot of different types of benefits, and you heard Robin talk about some of them. Some of them are easier to model, some of them are harder. So we'll look at kind of the different types and with some of the studies that quantify some of those types and some that are not really well quantified. And then we'll spend a little bit of time kind of zeroing in on a couple of studies that forecast or estimate the benefits of markets in the West. And we'll talk both about the electricity system benefits and then also about how those might flow into the broader economy. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And with that and the slides up, I think we can move to the next slide. Yay. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is just the context for what we mean when we talk about benefits or savings in markets. We've all heard that there are a lot of benefits or savings from organized markets up to and including that regional transmission organization or RTO that you heard Robin talk about. But I think it's really important to level set and to understand what we mean when we say benefits or savings. It is not intended to mean that electricity prices are going to go down from today's levels. Rather, what we mean is that we're going to look at the future electricity costs. So you can kind of see them in this blue bar on the left here that goes up over time, right? We're going to look at them under a business as usual, continuing what we have today. And then separately, we'll study what those might look like in a future market scenario. And then if you subtract those two, that's what we mean when we say electricity system kind of benefits or savings from a market. So, not intended to imply that the savings mean overall electricity prices are going to go down. Maybe that's possible, but it's not what we're saying when we say there are savings. We're just saying that compared to a business as usual, costs will be lower. As we all know, there are rising pressures on electricity prices. So this, again, just last time I'll say it, not intended to imply that costs will go down with markets, but they'll go down relative to where they otherwise would be. All right, with that, we can turn to the next slide. And now that we've laid that foundation, just wanted to give a little bit of context. There are a lot of studies out there. Robin mentioned them. I think if you look at the link to the report on the very right-hand side of this slide, the draft ACR 188 report, I'm not going to go into what that is, but if you look at that report, I think it goes through dozens of different studies that have been done on the potential benefits of markets. Some of them are, Western focused, some of them are broader than that. But I really wanted to focus my remarks on 3 studies that have been done somewhat recently, within the last 2 years or so, and they're focused on the West and the benefits of expanding markets in the Western United States. They all also were done by my firm, Energy Strategies, and so I'm familiar with them, so it makes it easier for me to speak to them generally. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Before we dive into what the results of those studies are, I wanted to spend a minute talking about the different types of energy market benefits that might flow from creating an organized market. There's a lot of different categories here, and Robin really went through some of these quite well, and you'll probably hear more about them later today. But at a high level, we have 4 types on the slide here. You could probably break these out a number of different ways. But the first 3 in that little stack are all kind of electricity system related benefits. And the bottom one is kind of non-energy savings, what flows into the broader economy. If we start with the top little oval there, operational savings. So operational savings are really the savings that come from operating the existing grid more efficiently. You heard Robin talk about the pancakes, the not good pancakes of pancaked rates. If you get rid of those, how can we operate the system more efficiently? How can we, if we have a centralized entity, dispatching resources, how might that prevent the wasting or curtailing of renewable resources like wind and solar? All of those things are really captured in that operational savings bucket. Those savings can be, I think there's some fairly standardized methods for quantifying those operational savings. How can we dispatch the existing system more efficiently? And so you'll see those quantified quite frequently in the studies that are out there in the industry. But I do want to note, although they're quantified quite frequently, they may not be, probably aren't, the biggest category of benefits of markets. They're just easy to quantify, and so we see a lot of studies that kind of estimate these operational savings. And we'll talk more in just a minute about the state-led market study, which looked in part at the operational savings, and also a extended day-ahead market benefit study. So in addition to operational savings, one of the other categories of savings you'll see quantified in these studies quite frequently is called capacity savings. This is really, I think if we simplify it, this is operating the grid more efficiently, allowing you to have to build fewer resources in the future as needs for energy grow and as resources are retired. So capacity savings is taking advantage of the diversity in resource types and load to make it so we have to build fewer resources. And that's another category of benefits that there are some pretty standardized ways to calculate. And so you'll see it, those savings quantified in studies, and some of the ones we'll talk about momentarily. And then there's this other category of energy related savings, kind of in the gray here. There are a lot of other energy related savings that might be out there, from planning the transmission system more efficiently to allowing states and utilities to access a whole host of different resource types that might reduce their overall costs, that are challenging to quantify or might be considered subjective. And so you don't see these quantified as frequently, and we're not going to talk about any quantification of these types of benefits today. But if you talk to folks who operate in RTOs, in other parts of the country, they will typically say that these are pretty substantial benefits for them. So difficult to quantify, and therefore we don't have numbers, but probably fairly large. Okay, the last category of energy market benefits that we will talk about is really a category of, if you have lower electricity prices than you otherwise would, that flows into the rest of the economy and creates kind of ripple effects. So what might the savings and electricity costs do for the rest of the economy? We call these non-energy savings. They might create new jobs and economic growth, increases in gross state product or tax revenues, etc. So those are the different types of energy market benefits kind of broadly that we're going to talk a little bit more about, at least 3 of them in the next couple of minutes. I'm going to go to the next slide. Kind of messy, but these are really those first 2 categories of benefits, the operational and capacity benefits that have been quantified in some recent studies. So there's a lot on this chart or this slide. This encompasses some study work that looked at a lot of different potential hypothetical futures for energy markets in the West. It looked not only at different potential footprints for these energy markets, but also at different levels of services being included. So you heard Robin talk about how today we have existing real-time markets that was captured in the status quo because we already have those today. But there's the option to add on to those, move to a day-ahead market structure, and then into an RTO. So this study work looked at all of those different things. I won't go through all of the numbers here today. I just want to highlight that the highest bar there, it's really 1.998, almost 2 billion in annual benefits or savings from RTOs, really came out of a study that looked at the largest geographic footprint, so kind of the entirety of the West, and the most comprehensive market structure, so an RTO. And a lot of the follow-on work kind of that we'll talk about a little bit more focused in on that scenario, but you can see that other market options like a day-ahead market also offer benefits. In this case, kind of the generic market, day-ahead market was quantified as having about $747 million per year in benefits across the West. I'll just briefly mention, but won't spend too much time on it, on the right-hand side, those last 2 kind of study bars. Those were looking specifically at some of the design choices that were made by the California Independent System Operator, or CAISO, and its extended day-ahead market, EDAM. There were some specific additional products that were added to that market design, and so that increased the estimated benefits from that market, and that's what you see on the far right there, with benefits of 1.2 roughly $1 billion per year in a 1 market EDAM scenario. All right, let's go to the next slide, which is more from the state-led market study that looked at these benefits, but really focusing in on that highest bar, which had the large market footprint covering the entirety of the West and the comprehensive market service offerings of an RTO. You recall that was estimated as having about $2 billion a year in benefits across the West. Just wanted to point out here that we're talking a lot about the Pacific Northwest today. Washington and Oregon really had very high estimated benefits in that study. I think they take something like maybe a little less than 40% of the benefits across the West. So some significant benefits that could potentially be offered to those states from an RTO and or other structures. I won't spend a ton of time going through all of this, but I also wanted to highlight some of the other things that were quantified but not monetized in that study to kind of get at some of those benefits that were in that non-quantified category, the gray bar or gray oval about 2 slides ago. So the study also showed that when we operate the West under a West-wide RTO, there are other benefits like reduced renewable curtailment. That's when you waste wind or solar because you don't really have anywhere to send it. If you have a broad market that is optimized, you have a less renewable curtailment. It really cut renewable curtailment about in half, not quite, but almost in half, just from operating a West-wide RTO across our region. Additionally, without any new policies or changes in policies, there was a reduction in CO2 emissions, about a 2% reduction, 3.2 million tons per year. Again, without changing any policies, just because you're operating the system more efficiently, and therefore those resources that are kind of more fuel efficient run more, and those that are less fuel efficient run less. Okay, I think with that, we can turn to the next slide. Trying not to get distracted by the chat, but it looks like there's a lot coming in.
We'll get to that, Caitlin, after your presentation.
Thanks, Lauren. Okay, last really topic that I wanted to touch on is another study that was performed for Advanced Energy Economy, now called Advanced Energy United, that aimed to do something that really hasn't been done a lot in a lot of other studies. That is to take those benefits that we saw on the last slide, but $2 billion per year across the West in electricity cost savings, and analyze how they might flow into the rest of the economy, create additional spending for households, maybe attract new businesses that are or businesses that are looking to expand because their electricity prices are lower than they otherwise would be. And then also create additional investment in clean energy because there are new ways to contract for clean energy resources, especially for corporate buyers in an RTO. So this study, the West-wide results were released in July of last year and really aimed to quantify what the broader economic impacts would be to jobs, gross state product, tax revenues, etc. Before we go to the next slide, I'll mention this study does include a pretty wide range because this is uncertain, right? We are uncertain exactly how the economy will respond to changes in electricity prices. For instance, having electricity prices that are lower than they otherwise might spur a lot of increased business activity. We might see a lot of data centers located in the West that wouldn't otherwise be, or maybe it doesn't. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's why you'll see a large range associated with the economic impacts from this study. And with that caveat, we can turn to the next slide. So looking at the broader economic impacts of a West-wide RTO, study found when looking across those 3 categories on the last slide, that you could see increased gross regional product across the West between $18 billion and $79 billion per year, could create between 159 and 657,000 additional permanent jobs, and create additional tax contributions while also spurring additional clean energy investments, as I mentioned, to meet corporate sustainability goals, because the avenue for contracting to meet corporate sustainability goals is really opened up under an RTO. So pretty significant potential economic benefits there as well. And with that, I think I will stop and happy to try to answer any of the questions, Lauren, or wait till the end.
No, thank you so much, Caitlin. That was a great overview. Really appreciate that. I do want to try to get at some of the questions in the chat. We're going to talk a little bit about transmission later in the panel, but Caitlin, I'm wondering if you might be able to address how this study or other studies address transmission system costs. Presumably a lot of the benefits are made possible by transmission investment. And so are we similarly looking at incorporating the cost of those additional transmission assets in these studies?
That's a great question, Lauren. You know, some of the studies we talked about in this presentation in particular, like the state-led market study, were very conservative in what they assumed would be built on the transmission system, really looking at only those projects that had really cleared all the regulatory hurdles and were effectively under construction. So yes, there is some additional transmission build out assumed in that study, but it's pretty minimal. Really wanted to try to focus in on what benefits could be captured without necessitating additional transmission build, right? So, that study didn't look at a large build out of transmission in the primary studies. There were some sensitivities with additional transmission, but they didn't kind of conduct a full cost benefit analysis. I think there are other studies out there that may do that as well.
Thank you, Caitlin. I will also pose a question that Gary wrote in the chat, and maybe I'll put a little bit of a polish on this. Could you talk a little bit about distributed energy resources, looking at, you know, local generation, virtual power plant aggregation, and sort of how we might anticipate markets being able to value those resources more holistically?
Yeah, I think at a high level, you know, markets definitely create more price transparency across the entirety of the system. And so that helps tell us where distributed energy resources or demand response might be most valuable. And if we know that, we're likely to see additional deployments of those types of assets. Moreover, there are, you know, rules and regulations from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that kind of help promote some of those resources participating in these markets. And those are options that they don't have today in the way our market operates.
Great, thank you for that. I think some of these other questions we may get to talk about in the moderated Q&A. So thank you, Caitlin, so much for that presentation. I think now I want to pivot to our next presenter, who is Michael Milligan. Let's see, we can get the slides back up. And Michael will be talking about reliability and resilience and their role and the role that markets play in reliability and resilience.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Sound check. Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you also to the prior two presenters for hopefully making my job a little bit easier. My job is to talk about how markets can promote reliability and resilience. It's a huge topic, so we're going to skim the surface. If you can go to the next slide, please. What my former colleague Debbie Liu at NREL made me read this book called something like The Secret Steve Jobs Presentation Secrets or something like that. And it was all about giving a presentation and giving everybody the takeaway at the beginning. What was interesting was this book was like 150 pages long, and I got the point at the beginning. But so what I want to leave you with, and I will get into some of this a little bit more detail, characteristics of an efficient market, it should be technology agnostic and performance based. So in other words, the market shouldn't care what you are, the market should care what you do and how you do it. I will talk about the sumo wrestler principle of market design in a few minutes. And then one of the key takeaways for resilience is if you want to ride through a severe storm, the grid has to be larger than the storm. And in our context, we're really talking about the market needs to be larger than the storm. So next slide, please. There's been a lot of work on market structures, and this is sort of a visual. I'm not sure if it's terribly effective, but the idea here is over on the left, you've got the physical power system, and it's made up of wires and generators and all this stuff. On the right-hand side, the big circle, we have the power system operator. This could be a market operator if we're talking about an RTO context, could be the control room for an investor-owned utility. But the point is, when you insert the market and other institutional rules in the middle of all that, you want to do so in such a way that the power system operator has full access or nearly full access to the physical system. I don't want the physical system to have a bunch of capabilities that the power system operator can't access because a market rule says you can't do it or you shouldn't do it, or there's some other institutional filters. So it's really important that we, if we want to promote efficient operations and planning, we try to take that middle box of markets and institutional filters and make it so that we can get everything flowing both directions to the extent that we can. Next slide, please. So when we think about markets, Caitlin did a great job of talking about the various benefits of markets and different attributes, whether you've got a day ahead market or not, and so forth. And I think that's really instructive. But for the most part, we focus on trading of electricity, a megawatt hour, a kilowatt hour, and that's kind of the chief product of all the wholesale electricity markets. But there are some other things that are important also. And these are sometimes called ancillary service markets. The technical term can sometimes be referred to as grid services, things that you have to do to the grid to make it possible to deliver those megawatt hours to demand. And I don't have an exhaustive list here, but these are some of the really key ones. You need to have some kind of a ramping service or the capability of some generators, not necessarily all of them, but some of the generators to turn it up or turn it down, increase output or decrease output, depending upon the state of the system. We also need frequency regulation, and the frequency regulation comes in a couple of different buckets, the primary frequency regulation, secondary, and you don't need to know exactly what all these things are, but you need to know that we operate on an alternating current power system, and the current alternates, kind of goes back and forth, so to speak, at 60 hertz, 60,000 times per second, or 60 cycles per second, easy for me to say. And when that frequency gets to be too high, you run the risk of overloading. It could be transmission. You have equipment that may not like to run at a higher frequency, so it'll shut off. You have similar things happen at the low end. If frequency drops too low, there's a lot of electrical equipment that is smart enough to protect itself. And so we want to maintain frequency within a pretty tight band around the 60 hertz. Voltage support is important. Voltage support is not typically provided as like a real-time market. It's really more of it kind of depends on the situation. We're not going to talk too much about that today. And then spinning and non-spinning reserves, different operating paradigms have a little different ways of counting resources towards spinning and non-spinning reserves. But basically, this is the idea that you have to have some level of generation that's synchronized and spinning, but not fully loaded, so that it can ramp up, provide that ramping service. And you also need to have some form of non-spinning reserve, extra resources that you can call on, typically in about 10 minutes. And that's useful for significant load forecast errors, wind forecast errors, contingency, a large unit trips offline. You've got to be able to maintain the frequency and make sure that you get everything, I was going to say put back together, but you don't want it to fall apart in the first place. And so we have lots of things, lots of procedures and so forth that are in place to help ensure that things don't go south. And if they do, we have hopefully ways of managing that. Next slide, please. So the market principles, this is sort of a general look at things. I mentioned earlier that a good market should be technology neutral, because do I really care if a megawatt hour is coming from resource type A or B? I may care about the characteristics of that megawatt hour. Did I know it was coming? Could it drop off immediately? But for the hour that I'm focused on, for the moment at least, I don't really care where it came from. Now, there's some other aspects of availability that are important, and that should be characterized in the clear definition of the product. What is it that I want to buy or sell? When, how much, how often, how much of a notification is provided between the buyer and the seller, and there has to be a clear incentive for the resource to actually do what it said it was going to do. And so those are really important issues. And on the right-hand sort of column, larger is better. In other words, when we talk about larger markets, there is a cost of complexity in larger markets, but one of the key words that I hope you go away from here is the keyword of diversity, and we can take advantage of diversity among different operating areas, different balancing areas, and the bigger we get, the more that diversity benefit is going to come into play. So larger is better. Faster dispatch. Dispatch is essentially a economic rebalancing, if you're not familiar with that term. In an RTO and also with the energy imbalance market, every 5 minutes, the resource stack, the available resources are redispatched based on what's happened to the demand, what's happened with wind and solar, and it's an economic optimization, and so that subject to the physical constraints, you're getting the most cost-effective mix of resources. And as Caitlin pointed out, when you have larger, faster markets, as the various EIM and EDAM and other studies have looked at in the West, you get better cost savings. And of course, none of this is possible without transmission. That's probably a given. Transmission is huge, and it's always been difficult to build it. And I think in particular in the West, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this geographic diversity, and in the West, we have time zone diversity, which actually helps even more than like SPP. You saw it's like a smokestack in the middle of the country. It smooths everything: wind, solar, demand. It allows me to access a deeper pool of resources, and so that can make the market more effective, because if the next resource that I need in my balancing area is $60 a megawatt hour, but if I can access a remote resource for $40 a megawatt hour, I'll save money, and that's essentially what happens. So we get this incredible economies of scale in large electricity markets, and that's the energy part. But it's also, as we're going to see in a minute, some of the grid services. Next slide, please. All of this sort of takes me to a simple example. You've seen a map like this before. The different balancing areas. When you overlay the EIM on top of this, there's clearly a lot of market interaction between the various EIM participants. But the principle is here, like WACA, Western Area Power up in Wyoming, if they have demand going up at 200 megawatts at the same time that Public Service of Colorado's demand is falling by 200 megawatts, if they combined, they wouldn't have to take any operator action by increasing or decreasing a generator's output. And so we say that in this case, and this is a special case, the ramps cancel. The next slide, we have a slightly different version to illustrate that life isn't always so nice. Sorry, we're missing one here. There we go. In this very similar example, WACM demand goes up by 200 megawatts, but PSCO is only dropping by 100 megawatts. So we still get a pooling saving of 100 megawatts. And so this type of savings can appear throughout a large market. So if we had some new version of RTO West that covered all the BAs that you see here on the screen, this effect would be compounded every time we add a new balancing area into the mix. And of course, a transmission constraint may make it either difficult or impossible, or may decrease this net benefit. But At the same time, we do have at least some transmission here in the West. Next slide, please. So given all these things, I've sort of coined this term, the sumo wrestler theory of electricity market design. You want the market to be big, and you want the market to be fast. And Caitlin gave you a long list of studies in the West that have been done in the last couple of years. I think my first work on the EIM went back to somewhere around 2010, 2011, something like that. And this graph, I'm not going to go through it in detail because there's a lot of stuff behind this. But what we did, if you start over at the right-hand sort of box, that was an attempt to capture business as usual before any EIM existed. And the data we had at the time was 10-minute data. And so we said, okay, you've got these small balancing areas, and again, in the right-hand box, what's the impact of speed? In other words, if I can get them all to speed up to a 10-minute economic dispatch with a 10-minute notification period, that's the blue at the top of the legend there, and compare that to a dispatch every hour or 60 minutes with a 40-minute look ahead. And so without going through all the gory details, in that right-hand box, the green bar says that you need a lot of regulation, and this is looking at the overall Western footprint. And if everybody stays small but goes fast, we can get our way down to the blue bar, which is a little hard to see, but it's a little over 2,000 megawatts. We repeated the same exercise for like a medium sort of regional market where we had Northern Tier Transmission and Columbia Grid, and kind of divided that way. And so the bigger group had a smaller regulation requirement at all time periods. And then finally, way over on the left-hand side, we said, what if the West is one big happy family? We're not there yet. But if we're one big happy family, even if we operate with a 1-hour dispatch, we can save a lot of regulation compared to the business as usual. But if we go to a 10-minute market and a 5-minute, it's going to be a little bit better. We can reduce our regulating reserve to about 1,000 megawatts. So the main message here is bigger and faster both count, and this is one way of many of looking at that. Next slide, please. So what about reliability? I'm not going to drag you through all the gory details of this curve. Well, maybe a few of them. This curve, the black line, shows this is like a generic disturbance, and by disturbance I mean maybe a large transmission line has tripped offline, or a generator is tripped offline, and in this case the frequency, which is supposed to be right at 60 hertz, give or take a little bit, the frequency falls because we're losing a bunch of generation, and there are a number of processes that kick into place to restore the frequency, and it turns out that wind and solar, any inverter-based resources, can do a lot to help reduce the that bottom that you see. It's called the nadir, the bottom part of the curve. I'm not going to talk about that, but as time goes on, and if you follow the horizontal axis, you get up to, you can see the 30-second marker, and then we get into sort of the minutes time frame. A 5-minute economic dispatch can help with that part of the recovery period, which takes the frequency, it's hard to see the number, but it takes the frequency back up to nominally to 60 hertz. And so the market can do that in part because it redispatches every 5 minutes anyway. And so, and it's also automatic. You have, all the market participants have telemetry and stuff that's sending all kinds of data into the system operator, the market operator. And so if the frequency all of a sudden drops, the market software sees that and it says, okay, I've got to start scrambling. There also could be a possibility of doing a manual dispatch, and I know all the RTOs have this capability. Things are getting a little rough around the edges. The operator could hit this big button and do a dispatch, even though it's only been 2 minutes since the last one. But you have incredible visibility on the system when you have markets because you want to be able to tell generators to go up and down based on their economic bids. And so in order to tell them whether to go up and down and to pay them accordingly, you need to know where they are right now, and you need to know where the demand is right now. And markets provide, in order to have a market, you have to provide all of the telemetry and all the monitoring equipment so that you know what's happening. And so during a disturbance, not only do you have the economic dispatch kicking in to help you, you also have a system operator who can look at a screen or probably several screens and say, oops, we got a problem. And I might not have noticed that had we not had all the market support technology in place. And I'll also note down here at the bottom, there's a FERC staff paper. This is done back in, I think, 2013 or so. It was a qualitative assessment of the benefits of the energy imbalance market, reliability benefits. It's non-quantitative, but I think it's worth looking at if you're interested in some of these other impacts. But certainly visibility is a huge thing, and the ability to rebalance quickly, especially after a disturbance, can certainly help with reliability. I'm probably going a little slower than I need to here, so if we can speed up, that message is for me, so I can talk a little faster. Large planning areas and markets can reduce the need for installed generation. You may have heard about, it's not exactly a standard, but the loss of load expectation of 1 day in 10 years. It's a target that's been around for a long time. Nobody really knows exactly where it came from. It's a nice round number, 1 in 10. One of my colleagues at NREL and I did a study looking at the West. And what we did, if you recall that big map of all the balancing areas in the West, we said, okay, let's assume that every region has its own planning target of 1 day in 10 years, and how much generation would they need to build. And so we went through that calculation and added up all the sort of the generic generation in order to hit the reliability target of 1 day in 10 years. And then we said, we did a couple of cases, but the extreme case was to say, suppose that, again, we have this big happy family in the West, and we've got this perfect planning, we've got this perfect transmission system with no constraints. What would that do for us? And we found that we could reduce the installed generation in the West by about 60 gigawatts out of the scenario we had at the time was 240. So that's like a, 20-25% savings in capacity. And when you build capacity, you're building, could be wind or solar or gas or whatever it is, you're building an asset that is going to depreciate over time. Transmission also does depreciate over time, but much more slowly. But we know, not in my lifetime, we're never going to have perfect transmission probably anywhere, but certainly not in the West. But this indicates that there's a big potential benefit to doing some regional planning and trying to design and build these transmission lines so that not only can we get all the benefits from day-ahead unit commitment and real-time markets, but we can also get some benefit from coordinated planning. And I think, a couple of people have already mentioned the fact that we have difficulty doing that in the West. All right, let's go on to the next slide. There's a digital revolution happening in the power system. My friend Mark Ahlstrom at NextEra has really done a nice job of kind of encapsulating this. Wind and solar and storage, battery storage, they're all connected to the grid by an inverter, and the inverter takes a direct signal and direct current signal and converts it to an AC signal. These devices are basically computers. They have a physical input. They can create, it's kind of a simulated waveform, and the software can do all kinds of stuff. And so in a sense, we can actually program the behavior we want into the inverter. And when we do that, and if we do it properly, go to the next slide, please, we can get these inverters to mimic a lot of the the services that we're already getting from gas and from coal plants. So renewables can provide a lot of these services. And one of the things about markets, I go back to my technology agnostic, if you specify what it is you need and when you need it and so forth, and then you let the market decide who can do it most economically. The renewables can provide most of these services, and in many, many cases, they can provide these grid services faster and more accurately than conventional generation. There are a couple of really interesting studies that have compared the behavior of wind plants with gas plants, solar and gas, and it's really a startling result. So we shouldn't put in a constraint that says only certain types of resources should be able to provide these services. We ought to be able to say anybody can do it if, and I stress the if you're capable of doing it, and you know, we can have a market or maybe some other long-term contract to provide things like voltage support, which wind and solar can do even if they're not generating. Next slide, please. I'm not going to belabor this. This is a table that I put together a couple of years ago for an article in the Electricity Journal. You can read all about it. It's kind of a qualitative comparison of various types of resources and what types of grid services they can provide and how well they can provide it. So I'll leave that for your reading pleasure. Go on to the next slide. So resilience, you know, there are a lot of good examples, and there are many reports that do kind of a post-mortem on the recent storms, Uri, whoops, I can't, the memory escapes me here, but last year, Elliott, sorry. And more and more often you can see people are starting to capture the effects of what happens during the storm. And so when MISO was doing reasonably well and SPP was not doing so well, and CERC was not doing so well, MISO was able to export to help them through. And that's kind of what I mean by getting a grid that's bigger than the storm. We do have a number of mechanisms in place between, for example, MISO and SPP that allow for various types of emergency, you know, helping the neighbors sort of thing. And those are great. But the point is, if you have this really big grid and a storm that's smaller, it helps you because you can send energy from places that are not so affected by the storm to places that are. Next slide, please. Just an example, this shows prices, and basically the blues and light blues show areas that have low market prices. The areas in red and orange show high market prices. You can skip to the next slide. And this is simply an illustration that we have a whole bunch of energy trapped in the lower peninsula of Michigan, for example, that can't make its way to the Midwest, where you see all those red. They'd be willing to pay big bucks, but you just can't move the generation. That's transmission, but it's also a market issue. Next slide, please. So that's kind of where we are. The large markets have a lot of benefits to cost, reliability, resilience. Products should be well-defined. We talked about that. And the markets ought to be technology neutral. If you can do it, we'll pay you to do it. We don't care who you are, we care what you can do. And of course, transmission is necessary. That's something that's, I guess, pretty obvious. And with that, I'll stop, and we can move on to what's next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that great information. I did want to go to a few of the questions that showed up in the chat, and I'll try my best to sort of summarize what I think we're getting at here. You talked a lot about how these markets can provide better price signals and better value for grid services. Could you talk a little bit about how distributed energy resources, like potentially controllable water heaters, electric vehicle chargers, can participate in markets for frequency regulation and voltage support, and curtailable loads for spinning and non-spinning reserves?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we know that there are some really significant capabilities of all those devices. One of the things that makes it a little bit difficult in some markets. So I live in Colorado, and my utility is Excel Colorado, Public Service Colorado, and they're kind of a soups to nuts organization, right? They have they own distribution, transmission, they own resources, and so for Excel to put something like that in place, or any other IOU, I'm going to say it's easy. The folks at Excel would maybe object to that characterization. It's relatively easy because you've got one sort of corporate structure that does all that stuff. Some markets, and this wouldn't necessarily be the case in the West, except maybe California, when you've divorced the resource ownership and the distribution system from the wholesale system, it's an extra layer of I'm going to call it bureaucracy for the moment. I mean, you've got to get the distribution folks to talk to the transmission folks and work out, the protocols. How is this going to happen? When you have lots of small resources like vehicle to grid or something like that, you need some sort of aggregation function. It doesn't necessarily have to be a company, but some organization that can aggregate these capabilities and put them together to provide, some people call it a virtual power plant, where I've got 5,000 vehicles spread all over Colorado, and I can do something with it to make it appear to be a power plant. I think that there's a large and promising future in that, but I think it's going to take some careful work to figure out how to do it and how to do it right.
Great, thank you, Michael. I might go with one more question. You talk, about how the size of the market is really, really important to derive some of these benefits. Speaking to the sort of Pacific Northwest, Western situation specifically, can you talk a little bit about the challenge of seams and sort of what might be presented if, for example, we're not able to get a full West-wide market, but we are having to sort of negotiate around these seams agreements? Is there anything that you feel like we should be paying attention to or looking to as it relates to seams?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I can sort of address it from two perspectives. As we saw earlier, we have a little bit of competition in the West with respect to, is it going to be SPP or the California EDAM or something like that? One answer is that the seams between markets are generally, I'm going to say easier to deal with because you've only got two entities that you've got to get to work together on figuring out how to transfer power. I know SPP and MISO have done a lot of work on that. And I don't remember exactly where it landed, but they have the availability to interchange, I think on a 5-minute basis, at least during emergencies. When you then say, well, I have something like an EIM with a bunch of utilities in and a bunch of other ones out, how do you negotiate that? It could be some sort of a pooling arrangement. We've had various power pools in the West for years. The power pool originally was designed to manage contingency events. If you had like a resource that trips offline, and the sort of the obligation of the different parties, even though they're not, so the umbrella that they're under would be the reserve sharing pool. And I think that some organization like that for the utilities that are not part of the EIM, or whatever the market structure is, I think can be really useful to specify what happens during emergency situations. Sorry, and those can include big storms, because we haven't really until recently thought too much about these big storms.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, next we're going to go to our final panelist, who is Kathleen Stacks from Western Freedom. Kathleen is going to talk about some of the broader public policy goals, advocacy opportunities, and sort of help us answer the question, why now? Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you, Lauren. And thanks for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about, as Lauren mentioned, some of the politics around this. And I'm also going to kind of walk through the state of market development efforts right now too. So we can, and I know Robin touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into this. So yeah, next slide. So Western Freedom is an organization that really is focusing on the politics of this. We are a political campaign, and we're basically in existence to bring the voice of the large commercial and industrial customer to this issue and to this effort. In part because there are so many large companies now that have pretty aggressive climate sustainability goals, and they are unable to meet them with the way with the status quo in the West. I mean, I think even if you look at where some of these clean energy buyers are doing deals and getting their having projects built to serve their assets, there's so much more happening in places where there are existing RTOs and markets in other parts of the country than there are in the West, because we don't have a particularly efficient system. So bringing the voice of the customer, bringing the priorities of the customer to this issue, I think is a really important one, and actually and helps us overcome some of the political divide around this, because these are business interests in many ways can help transcend some of the political challenges. Next slide. These are some of the priorities. Obviously, we've talked a lot about why an RTO in the West is important and beneficial, but these are really some of the highlights for why these are important to customers. Reliability is a huge issue, and whether you've got somebody running a data center or manufacturing chips or running a mining company or operation, keeping the lights on and keeping the power going is economically imperative for many of these companies. The low cost, being able to continue to do the build out in a more efficient and effective way is really going to save costs that we would otherwise see, because we need to continue to build. So if you can plan it and build it in a much more efficient way, if you can essentially, you can build less when you have a market that covers a bigger footprint. So, but we still have to build a ton. I think I've seen numbers, in California alone, we're building, I think, somewhere between 2 and 3 gigawatts of new energy right now, and we need to triple that every year for the next 6 years just to meet California's goals. And we've got 85% of the West that lives in a place with clean energy goals. We, as we're seeing our resource mixes change, as we're seeing the electrification of more parts of our lives, certainly we're just going to continue to need more. And so doing it in a way that can, meet all of the optimization benefits that Michael kind of walked through from a geographic and time zone standpoint, will really help us maximize those benefits. And I think one of the other things that it does is it enables more diverse energy resources. There's no one thing that's going to solve the challenges that we have right now. There's no two things. We're going to need a lot of different kinds of energy in different places at different scales, and having a market having an RTO to really kind of manage the system as a whole is going to really be have incredible benefits. Next slide, please. We can kind of skip through this one because I really kind of touched on it all already. So where are we now? There have been efforts in the past to create a Western RTO, and for a variety of reasons they have failed. And so in 2021, when the bills in Colorado and Nevada passed requiring utilities to join an RTO, there really picked up, I think, a very different kind of momentum than we've seen in the past. And I think with the real-time markets, the EIM from CAISO that's been in existence since 2014, and the WISE from SPP that's been in existence since 2021, we're really starting to see some of the scale of the economic benefits that we can realize with some of these market developments. So there's a lot that's changed now than has been in existence even in the last 5 years or so. And so we're seeing a lot of momentum. We're seeing a lot of stakeholders engaged. We're seeing more of an interest in this as we see more extreme weather events. We have to find a way to work together across this vast region. And so there's a lot more interest and momentum going on now than we've seen in the past. So some of those changes include the development of day-ahead markets. So CAISO is working on their extended day-ahead market, and Southwest and SPP is working on Markets Plus. And I'll touch on both of those. I'll sort of walk through sort of the status and where they are right in a moment. But those are going to, this is, I think it's also worth noting that in the West, we like to do things at an incremental pace. And so we're taking baby steps, we're building trust, we're seeing that these things are really working. And I think we're seeing that with these day-ahead market developments that will likely have more that will likely be implemented in the next 2 to 4-ish years, I think. Another thing that is sort of that has changed just in the last couple of weeks is that there was another bill introduced in California to change the governance structure of CAISO. So part of the reason that CAISO can't just expand into the West is because their governing board is appointed by the governor and approved by the Senate, and there are no other states who want to participate in something where the decisions are being made by California. So that change has to go into effect so that California has so that the ISO can even be an operator to serve for the rest of the West. And so that there have been previous efforts to do this in California as well. And I think there's again, a lot of things that are different now than have been in the past. So we are optimistic, cautiously optimistic that we can get a bill through in California. There's a coalition that's building that brings together diverse interests to support this. I think there's an interest among Californians in seeing California work with other states. So really, I think there's a lot of opportunity. Even seeing the way the EIM helped keep the power on during last fall's heat event is something that I think is sort of building support for the regionalization conversation in California. We've got new people in states. We've got a handful of new governors. We've got a handful of new utility commissioners. And so I think there are some opportunities here to continue to build the education and build some champions across the West towards more regional collaboration. And then, of course, there's always action at FERC. FERC's had several transmission NOPRs that have been open over the last couple of years. They just approved the Western Resource Adequacy Program just last week. So that was a big deal and an exciting. Yes, sorry, thank you. My busting out the acronyms. But having the WRAP, that Western Resource Adequacy Program, having that approved by FERC will enable that to get going as well. And so that's a really big deal for all of the resource adequacy efforts that we have ongoing in the West. Next slide. So I'll dive in a little bit on each one of these issues and sort of where they are right now. So California, the CAISO's extended day ahead market just got approved by their board and the governing body of the EIM, that real-time market, just a couple of weeks ago as well. And so the next step is for CAISO to file their tariff at FERC, which will likely happen later this spring. That's at least a 60-day process, and that timeline can, well, it's a 60-day process that can be extended if FERC puts out a deficiency notice. And since this is a new thing, this FERC hasn't really looked at anything like this before. There's, I wouldn't be surprised if there is a deficiency notice that extends that timing out. That's what we saw with the RAP program. It did ultimately get approved. So I think we feel, I think there's a good, I think we are optimistic also that can go through the process relatively quickly. There are still some things with the day-ahead market to be worked out. There's still, I think, some issues around transmission, and there's still some issues around things like GHG accounting. And so there will be lots of opportunities for stakeholders to engage in that and continue to help CAISO figure out exactly what those offerings should look like. Once they get the FERC approval, we're looking at probably 12 to 18 months of implementation. I think you'll see probably you'll see more utilities joining and getting the sort of software and hardware pieces implemented into their own systems so that it can be fully operational in early 2025. Right, so far, PacifiCorp is the only utility that has committed to join EDAM, and they made that announcement in December. I do expect, given some of the conversations that we've been having with utilities around the West, I do expect to see some additional utilities commit to join EDAM in the coming months. And, that is a good thing because, again, I think Michael hammered this home pretty well. The larger the footprint, the bigger the benefits. And so the more utilities that sign up to a day-ahead market offering, the better off it will all be. The EIM currently covers about 80% of the West, and that's 22, I think that's right, 22 entities that participate in the EIM market, and they've seen, this last quarter, they put out quarterly reports to show the economic benefits, and this last quarter was the second largest quarter. They've seen basically over $3 billion in benefits for the participants of the EIM since its inception in 2014. Next slide, please. On the other side, SPP is working on their day-ahead market. They call it Markets Plus. There are some similarities and there are some differences. And I think we've seen very robust stakeholder engagement in both of these processes. SPP is about, I would say, probably about a year to 18 months behind CAISO in their day-ahead market development. But they are working hard every day to speed that up and cut that gap. They put out their sort of final service offering in the end of November of last year, and they are starting this next phase of really developing the details of the market and the tariff beginning in April of this year. And so they have, I have on here that it's going to be somewhere between 12 and 21 months. Originally, they were saying it was going to be 21 months. And then I have been hearing that they are looking to hire some consultants to help them shrink that down to a year. So likely somewhere in that time frame. And I think we expect to see Markets Plus operational in early 26. They will also have to file at FERC and get approval for this offering. And so right now, what we're seeing as far as the utility commitments go, there are a handful of utilities that have committed to fund this next phase. And there are some requirements as far as the number of utilities and the sort of size of the footprint, and having at least 2 contiguous balancing authorities participating in this next phase for them to move forward. I think they've already I think they've already hit that threshold. PowerX, which is a power marketer out of California, Canada, has committed to join Markets Plus. They are the only one who's actually made that big of a commitment. But others have shown up and said, yes, we'll fund this. A lot of that, I think, is, and that includes BPA and many of the Northwest public power utilities that have said we want to participate in the next phase of this market development. Doesn't mean they're necessarily going to join it at the end, but this is they've basically raised their hand and said, let's keep working on this. What often that we hear from many of these utilities that they want to be able to evaluate multiple options before they jump all the way in. So I think we will continue to see more utilities and other participants. They have essentially any stakeholder can show up and participate in this process that wants to, if you're willing to pay the fee. So so we will be participating in both of these processes as well over the coming year. Next slide, please. At the same time that SPP is working on their day-ahead market, they are also working on expanding their RTO footprint. And so they operate an RTO on the west side of the Eastern Interconnect, and they are looking to expand into the west. And there have been a handful of utilities, primarily in Colorado and Wyoming, and a little bit into Montana, that have committed to join the RTO West. And I think we will, when I last had a conversation with someone at SPP, it sounded like they have to make sort of an official announcement by the beginning of March. So just here in a couple of weeks. And then it's a 2-year timeline to fully integrate. The SPP will have to go back to FERC as well to get approval for that tariff. And I think one of the things that's worth noting that's interesting about this is that there have been all of these efforts with the day-ahead market developments, both with SPP and with CAISO, that many stakeholders have been involved in. Governance has been an enormous part of this conversation. With an SPP RTO, the governance is already set. So this is really just a proposed expansion of their footprint. It won't be the same, it won't look the same as what we've seen. Next slide, please. Michael talked quite a bit about resource adequacy and all those different pieces, and resource adequacy is a big part of the market of an RTO, and something that I think collectively entities decided they didn't want to wait, and so worked with the Western Power Pool to develop this Western Resource Adequacy Program, the RAP. And so this is going to, when utilities are joining the RAP, they're essentially committing that they will have all the resources that they can firm up all of the resources that they need to meet their capacity, all the load that they need to serve in the future. There were 11 utilities that announced in December that they are going to join the RAP. And so that is, I think that's a really exciting place to start. PacifiCorp is one of those. Interesting thing at this point, some of the criticism that we hear about the RAP is that it doesn't, well, it's not actually more about CAISO. CAISO and the RAP are not, they're not, fully integrated and working well together yet. And I think one of the indicators of sort of trust that this is going to get worked out is that PacifiCorp announced at the same time that they were going to join EDAM and they were going to join the RAP. And so using that as sort of a forcing mechanism for them both to work together.
Did we lose the slides?
We lost the slides.
Oh no.
I was
okay.
like,
What happened? 1 second, maybe we can get them pulled back up here.
and I can just touch on one more thing too. So if you don't get the slides, that's totally fine. And I mentioned this earlier, but there was a bill that was introduced in California to change the governance structure of CAISO, which is gonna be necessary for if CAISO is going to be if CAISO is going to operate an RTO that covers multiple states in the West. So that change will have to happen. And I think one of the things that does is if it is successful, it will enable other states in the West to get together and go through some of this stakeholder process and collaboration to actually develop a state and a governance structure and a market structure that works for those very different states and entities. So that's sort of the state of play right now. And I think, one of the biggest challenges that we're working on really is the politics. The West is very diverse politically. And so trying to pull together states like California and Montana into the same conversation and work on the same things can be really challenging. But I think one of the great things about working on this is that there are benefits that sort of meet the priorities of everyone. So you can kind of transcend the politics by talking about reliability and talking about affordability. Everybody's going to get climate benefits from these as well. It's just not what you lead with in some states. So I think the great thing is that we've got a platform here to have some of these more politically challenging conversations.
Great,
and
thank you,
I
Kathleen.
can stop. Yeah, I'll stop there.
No, that's great. So the rest of your slides talk a little bit about the goals of the campaign. And I think this is a really good probably point to pivot to Q&A, some of which are definitely pertinent to your presentation. So with that, let's see if we can get our panelists all spotlighted for Q&A. And I will just start by posing a question. I am targeting this for both Kathleen and Robin. We've heard a lot about some of the technical and market design questions. I think in your mind, what are the most important policy and governance issues for state regulators and policymakers to consider when evaluating these market proposals? For example, Robin, you talked a little bit about the benefits associated with reduced renewable curtailments and what that actually might mean on the ground for project development and jobs at the state level. I'm curious if you guys could talk a little bit more about, some of the ways that the benefits will translate at the kind of policymaker and regulator level into actual things that they could point to in terms of increased transparency, increased job growth, those sorts of things.
Sure, I'll take a stab at this first. There's a lot to that question. I think as far as what policymakers and especially regulators in the state need to keep an eye out for is to make sure that they still have a voice in the process. Regional organizations have varying governance structures. Some are much more open to stakeholder participation than others. Several of them, such as MISO and CAISO, have special regulating bodies where the regulators can participate in different aspects of the market and policies. And this is important because states are still going to retain their authority over resource decisions within their state. They're still going to retain their authority over retail rates that their customers will be paying within the states. And so they need to make sure that whatever policies are being decided at the market level are compatible with the policies that they make at the state level. And I think one thing especially that markets can help with is it can help states such as Washington and Oregon meet their clean energy goals, primarily because renewables will be curtailed much less in the markets if designed properly. As I mentioned, the solar example in California, there's a lot of solar in California right now being curtailed because they don't have off takers for it during those times of day when the solar is strongest. However, if they have more connectivity to a wider market, you can actually build more solar in California than what they have now, much more solar, because other areas of the region can take advantage of that cheap resource. Similar with wind in Montana, for example. There's lots of potential to build wind in Montana, and even more will be built if we can be part of a regional market.
And I'll use this opportunity actually to sort of flag one other thing that I think is, it's not necessarily related to sort of the governance structure, but I think with all of these new resources and transmission that needs to be built, there's a lot of jobs. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And, you know, we have heard, and I think that that building is going to have to happen kind of everywhere. I think one of the great things about the West is that we do have so many diverse resources across the entire region. And so, you know, being able to tap into, and honestly, I don't think we have enough skilled workers today to be able to build as much as we need. And so I think there's a ton of sort of job development, workforce development opportunities here, and inherent sort of in this momentum and the work that we're doing. So wanted to take a moment and make sure we flag that piece, because there's so much that needs to get done, and a market is going to help us do that faster and more efficiently. I think the other, just from a sort of a policy standpoint, I think Robin's absolutely right. And I think one of the challenges that you see is even things like, because states with different climate policies account for things in different ways. And so creating a structure that enables states with, you know, on paper, sort of the same goals with 100% clean energy, but that, you know, take Washington and California, for example, they account for them very differently. So how do you have a system that can enable both of those states to meet their goals, track them in the right way? And so this has actually been one of the really challenging and sticky issues as governance discussions have gone on both at SBP and CAISO in the day-ahead market developments. So I think that the great thing is that there are so many interested and engaged stakeholders and groups, that we've got a lot of really great minds working on these things. There are opportunities. There's lots of opportunities for regulators to get involved in here too. So I think this is that these governance and market design conversations that have been so inclusive have really, I think, are going to benefit the region and the future state.
Thank you both. That was a very good answer. Next, I maybe want to pivot back to Caitlin. You know, your presentation on the benefits of a West-wide market, and especially the findings coming out of the state-led study, I think really highlighted some of the environmental benefits that we would expect. I'm curious if, you know, you could talk a little bit more about whether there are updated findings that support what you found back, you know, when the state-led study was conducted, and specifically how those environmental benefits would accrue to the Northwest.
So Lauren, that study was done not quite 2 years ago. So, you know, I don't think there are any updated kind of results at this point, but I think that the benefits, the environmental benefits and reduced curtailment and reduced CO2 emissions probably hold, you know, generally true. You could certainly do more study work. Always seems like there's more study work to do, even though we seem to get study fatigue. I don't have off the top of my head how those benefits accrue particularly to the Northwest. I think that especially for the greenhouse gas emissions, it gets really tricky, right? How are we actually accounting for, you might see emissions in one state go up, well, they go down even more in another state. And so I don't think that those results were reported that way for that reason, right? Like, let's look at the West as a whole. We're not talking about how individual states report and account for greenhouse gas emissions, but at the kind of broader societal level, what are the impacts and reduced emissions that we saw? So I don't know if that directly answers your question, but there you have it. Best I can do.
No, thank you, Caitlin. Does anybody else have anything they want to say about the benefits that weren't covered by Caitlin's presentation?
I think just one kind of general comment. I think Caitlin had a great answer, but the when you do something like this, you go to some new market structure, the benefits are not going to be equal, right? You have some areas that have, California is a good example. The cost of electricity in California is significantly higher than any place else. So the benefits in California might be different than the benefits of someplace else. And as Caitlin said, it's really, really hard to chase down some of the impacts from a large market to local. We tried that in, I think, our EIM study in 2012. My gosh, it's been 10 years. Trying to figure out, which state or which utility benefited and by how much. And it's hard because, so much of the market's a big pool, right? And so when you pool stuff, you're mixing it up with all the other pool entries, and then you try to tease it out to figure out. And I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's a difficult process to do for emissions, for cost, for anything else. But certainly on a global basis, and if you think about this from the point of view of an environmental benefit, we all more or less breathe the same air, and so you do want to chase down the local benefits if you can, but it's difficult to do right. It's easy to do wrong.
And I agree with that. And wanting to maybe take this a little bit different direction, Lauren, there were a couple of questions, and you asked me one earlier about, transmission costs. And I maybe didn't fully understand the context of the question, not having read the chat, but I think there were questions about, what do we do with potential costs of the existing transmission system and how we deal with them in a market. And that is a great question. There was kind of a question about, do we allocate them in accordance with benefits? I think those types of questions really are best answered when you're sitting in a room with the participants that are actually going to be in the market, right? If we try to do this in the theoretical, hypothetical participant context, it's really challenging. So they certainly can be addressed. I think a really good representation of that was done with the Mountain West Transmission Group, which was a group of entities that almost, but not quite, joined SPP in Colorado and Wyoming, and they had a very good structure for kind of addressing the sharing of transmission costs over a number of years.
Thanks for that, Caitlin. And then finally, I do just want to kind of pose a question that came up in some of the chat earlier, which is, there have been multiple attempts at trying to create a RTO or organized market in the West. Why hasn't this happened yet? First of all, and then what in all of your minds, Kathleen, you answered this a little bit, but I'd be interested in the other panelists' thoughts on this too. What makes this time different? And maybe I'll turn first to you, Robin.
I think forming a regional market is very complicated. We've only touched on the surface of those complexities, but especially transmission makes it extremely difficult. Bonneville Power Administration, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, owns 75% of transmission in the region, and they have a lot of legacy contracts that will be very complicated to unwind into a market if they were to join an RTO. I don't think it's impossible. I think the benefits are definitely out there. And I think really what's changing now is just the resource mix has changed so dramatically from what it used to be. It's not just fossil fuel plants transmitting power anymore. It's a lot of variable resources that are located in diverse geographic locations. And in order to maximize the economic efficiencies of that, we need a regional market. And I think more and more people in the region are starting to coalesce around that idea. And then state policies are driving it as well, with Oregon and Washington clean energy standards.
Thanks, Robin. Next, I'll go to Michael. Do you have a view on why this hasn't happened yet and what has changed?
Why is it hasn't? It's a difficult thing, and I think Kathleen talked about the diverse political range of politics in the West, and I think that's been something that has, people have different ideas about how to move forward. I remember when the EIM was a thought in Steve Boyning's brain at Excel 13, 14, 15 years ago. My thought was, oh, this is really easy. We'll just go off and we'll do a study, right? I was at a lab, so that's what we did. Go off and do a study and show everybody that, hey, this is going to benefit you by this many $1 million a year, and that didn't happen. We got a lot of rotten tomatoes thrown our way at the various PUC EIM meetings, and so I don't fully understand that. I remember folks at DOE telling me, hey, calm down, it'll take 10 years to get a market. And I guess that turned out to be true. But I agree, I think, with Robin that the renewables have accelerated the pace. But I find it a little bit ironic because all of these things we're talking about, transmission, large markets, people benefit without renewables. And you look at PJM, which is arguably certainly one of the most developed RTOs in the country, and they don't have that much renewable. And they've been going at this for a long time, and they did see a lot of benefits. The other thing is, it's interesting to me. This is a little bit off the question, but we've seen a bunch of utilities form together, various types of RTOs, and so forth. They tend to get larger. Nobody ever has gotten to the point where they say, oh my gosh, we're too big, we need to split up. MISO recently, it's not that recently, but they've extended so that now they basically go all the way north-south, kind of adjacent to SPP, which also started out pretty small, and it's now running all the way up the seam between the east and the west, all the way through Canada. And so nobody has decided they're too big and oh, we'd be better off if we get smaller. The contrary is that they've gotten bigger. And the same thing has been true with fast economic dispatch. Nobody has said, oh my gosh, 5 minutes. I mean, yes, it's hard to put that in place, but nobody has ever said, oh, we should really go back to hourly dispatch because of whatever reason. Texas was actually thinking about going to a 3-minute dispatch at one point, and I'm not quite sure why they gave that up. But sorry, I'll let somebody else put in their 2 cents worth. But it's a difficult thing to do.
And Caitlin, did you have a response to that?
Very quickly, I'd say, why it hasn't happened. We need another 2-hour webinar to go over that. So I won't touch on it. But why it might be different this time. I think Robin and Michael touched on all the key points. Maybe just said differently, I think the status quo of 38 balancing authorities is becoming more and more difficult to sustain. I've heard utilities say, it's great, we can quantify all these market benefits. But the reality is, I don't know how I'm going to operate my system if I don't have a market. I need it, right? It's not what the benefits are. It's the fact that I can't do it without it. So I think that might be why it's different this time. And that is, a factor of the changing resource mix across the West.
Thank you, Caitlin. And Kathleen, I'll let you wrap up this one.
Yeah, you bet. I mean, I think I'm not sure I have much to add at this point. Just aside from there's political will. We're hearing it from there's demand for this from the utilities that we didn't really have before. There's demand from large companies, from clean energy developers, from environmental organizations, from Even from some, labor groups, we're wanting to have a structure that can unlock all of these benefits. And there's still a lot of conversation out there about, how do you, I think we need to learn from some of the things that don't work as well in other markets. And we're designing something that is going to meet the needs of the grid of the future. So I think it's going to look different. And I think, but I do think there's a lot more just will and demand for it now than there has been in the past.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. We are nearing the end of our scheduled webinar time. I want to say a big thank you to our panelists, Kathleen, Michael, Caitlin, and Robin. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. And for those of you who are interested in seeing the recording, we will be sending out an email to let you know when that's available, as well as the slides, which will be posted on our website. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, and we look forward to continuing to work with you on these issues. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.